Good evening. Thank you, Summer.
You okay?
Thank you. Hello and welcome. It's so nice to have a big crowd, and I know it's not for me and us, but I want you to know that we are here compliments of, it's a special event for us because Humanities Washington is co-sponsoring this event. And of course, I'm from the Southwest Seattle Historical Society. I'm the chair of Buerge Writers and West Seattle. And I've been doing this for almost 6 years. This is one of the biggest crowds, and we're very pleased to host a gentleman like this. I'm going to ask our president, our board president, to come forward for a minute and say hello from the board and give you maybe a few commercials about things that are going on at the Historical Society. And then we will start your tap dance, okay?
Well, welcome. So nice to see such a full house. And thank you to Dorothy for getting this organized. Many of you may know that the Southwest Seattle Historical Society's mission is to preserve and promote the wonderful heritage that we have here on the Duwamish Peninsula through education, advocacy, and preservation. So that is what we do every day. We have a professional staff down at the Log House Museum. If you have not been down there to visit our exhibits that we have, you should make a little trip Thursday, Friday, Saturday, and Sunday, 12 to 4. It's a real jewel of a little museum, and we have an extensive collection of treasures of the history and stories from our peninsula. So it takes a community to support us, and we appreciate you being here tonight. And just to tell you, the next big event coming up is our home tour, which we call If These Walls Could Talk. And that will be on July 27th at the Coleman Estate. We're featuring the architect of the Coleman Estate, Arthur Lovelace, and the stories of the Coleman family, including a wedding gown from someone who was married there. So put that on your calendar for July 27th. And then the opening for our next exhibit, which is about the annexation of West Seattle to the city of Seattle, the opening is on August 17th. So we hope that you'll sign up for our, if you're not on our email list, or if you'd like to join the Historical Society, we'd love to have you. We just love seeing you all here to do exactly what our mission is, to preserve and promote and cherish the heritage we have that David is going to present to you tonight. So thanks for being here.
Thank you, Kathy. I've got a couple of other things to tell you. We are inviting you to sign your name and email address on this that we're going to pass around if we don't already have your name. I'm curious to know how you heard of us. Now, being sponsored by Humanities Washington and the library, I'm sure that some of you learned that way. How did you hear of it?
I saw it advertised in the West Side, Seattle.
What's it called? West Side?
West Seattle Herald.
Used to be the Herald, yeah, we all call it the Herald still, yeah. Wasn't that a great spread with the cover of the book and the big news? Somebody is here from Des Moines, the Davis is here from Des Moines. Are you the one that talked to on the phone? Oh, all right, you're welcome. And how did you hear about it? Excellent. Oh, she's already got a book here, so she went to say. I also wanted to kind of throw in about the If These Walls Could Talk. That was the first volunteer activity that I participated in when I first signed up with the Historical Society as a volunteer some 6 years ago. So if you'd be interested in that, please take this membership application. There's information about it. If you're not interested, or if you're already a member, we appreciate that. And you can just, pass the stack along. But I don't want to pass up that opportunity. So, okay. Our author and speaker tonight is David Buerge, a former teacher, writer, biographer and historian who has been professionally connected with Southwest Seattle since 1978 when he worked at the archaeological dig near Kellogg Island. You'll tell us where that is, right? I'm not from here, I don't know that. And he became a historian for the Duwamish tribe, Seattle's mother's people. Buerge spent more than 20 years exploring Chief Seattle and is presenting his book, Chief Seattle and the Town That Took His Name, the change of worlds in the small print for the native people and settlers on Puget Sound. Buerge, am I saying that right now? Buerge. He said it was a R-E. Buerge is an alum of the University of Washington and the Peace Corps. He has been researching the pre- and early history of the city of Seattle since the mid-70s and has published 14 books on history and biography. He was involved with the art for the Weather Watch Park on Beach Drive and the art installations on the Spokane Street Bridge. He was featured in the videos Landing on Alki and Chief Seattle, made by B.J. Bullard, and was involved with the tribe in their effort to gain support for their recognition by the federal government. Buerge has gathered together disparate accounts of the times between the 1780s and the 1860s, including native oral histories, Hudson Bay Company records, pioneer diaries, French Catholic Church records, and historic newspaper reports. Chief Seattle wrote nothing down during his life, yet his words, both real and imagined, are known throughout the world. The result is a man made up of both historical and fictional aspects from which conflicting messages can be gleaned. Our guest historian tonight produced the first thorough historical account of Chief Seattle and his times, the story of a half-century of tremendous flux, turmoil, and violence, during which a Native American war leader became an advocate for peace and strove to create a successful hybrid racial community. Chief Seattle's vision was ambitious, a prosperous, multiracial city, but toward the end of Seattle's life, he saw that vision become a tragedy. Let's hear about it. Please join me in a warm welcome for David.
Before we start, if I could ask you please to turn off your cell phones. I hear a number of them before we even start. We don't want to, I'm distracted easily, as my students knew. In any case, it's interesting. Now, can somebody tell me where north is? Point the direction north.
Behind you.
Oh, this is north. Okay, so that's west and east. All right. So it's interesting that we have the Log House Museum over here and the Longhouse, the Duwamish Longhouse on the riverside on the east. So two worthwhile things. I hope you will avail yourself to go into the Duwamish Longhouse. In any case, Chief Seattle. I have two maps that I want to just go over briefly as sources for you. You can use them while I'm talking, or probably you want to look at them later. Keep them if you wish. If you don't want them, leave them in the back there. In any case, the first ones are the big ones, and these are the maps that show this is Puget Sound in the center here. This is Seattle before all the changes took place. This is Bainbridge Island and Kitsap Peninsula. And this shows basically the scene of the action where most of the history took place dealing with Seattle. And over here you have the major Suquamish village, which is Dusaquah. And that's where the old man house was built. We'll talk about that briefly. On the other side, if you turn it over, you have a larger representation of Seattle. You have Elliott Bay, the Duwamish River, the Black River that connected with the lake, and the Cedar River, and then the White River, which came up from the south. Seattle's village that he grew up in was to the south here. It's a place called Chutapaqua, which means Flea's house. And just north of that was the house of the village of his mother, Tukaup, or Stoop, which meant log jam. We'll talk about those during the course of the evening. I also have some representations of early maps, and the place where Seattle actually gave his famous speech, the January 12, 1854 speech, is denoted by an arrow. And the arrow at the bottom here, in the lower right here, actually points out David Maynard's Seattle Exchange, which was his shop that he developed here with native help. And up on the top part, you have a diagram of Seattle as it appeared to somebody on board the Decatur, the USS Decatur. And the arrow there points to the little frame structure. That was the, again, Maynard's store. I point those out because that's where the speech was, that's where Seattle stood, just in front of that store. And I mentioned in the beginning of the book where that is. You can actually visit the site. You're about 20 feet over the site. In any case, these two maps may help you keep track of where we are. Let me start also by, we're talking about the name. I say Seattle, and I've lost count of the people who came up to me and said, you know, it's pronounced self. Well, no, it's not, because there's no TH in Puget Salish, there's no self. It's pronounced something like Seattle, Seattle. And there's a glottal stop after the C, which is a Seattle. And then you have that last sound, Seattle. And what that is a voiceless lateral alveolar fricative, which we don't have in the English language, which is difficult to pronounce. You put your tongue at the top of the roof of your mouth and you blow out the right side. On the left side, you get a different sound, but in a different sense. But in any case, because Seattle is closest to it, and during his lifetime, there was a newspaper article written that said, if you want to pronounce his name, it's 3 syllables, and the accent is on the middle syllable, Seattle. So that's easiest for us to pronounce. So who was this man? The title of my talk is, who was Chief Seattle? I can tell you right off the bat, he was one of the, if not the most important founder of the town of Seattle. There was no accident that Seattle grew up in Elliott Bay, because Seattle made sure the settlers came and settled there so that they could trade with his people. So that's one reason why he's very important. No other pioneer had the impact that he had on the first 2 or 3 years of that settlement. The second thing was his vision. Most of the time since his death, the vision has been submerged in interest about the speech, but his vision was for a multiracial hybrid community in which both native and white could prosper. That's the reason he invited the Americans up to settle. And he offered, basically encouraged them to intermarry with his people. There was a reason for that, other than in fact made practical good sense. But the point was, that was his vision. The Americans weren't ready for it, and certainly not by the mid-1850s, when there was a race war between whites and native people in this area. And for a century afterwards, it was simply not even conceivable that this could have been coming from Seattle. I mean, it's only been since the 1960s since the white frame of reference has changed so much, and we begin to see the sensibility of his vision and why it was so important, and why those first few years of the town's history were so important to its becoming what it has today. All right. When Seattle died on June 7, 1866, not a single territorial newspaper mentioned his death. By that time, he was old news. He was not considered important enough to write about. People knew that he had died, but there were no stories printed in any newspaper. There were stories of Mercer's maidens coming in. We'll talk about that, to provide wives, because, quote, there were no women in the area. Well, there were plenty of women. They were native women, but and a lot of Americans had already married native women. But to the literate elite, the middle-class Americans coming in, that was racial suicide. And so a very racist view obtained in the area. And the argument that they had to bring in women because there were none here is the one that basically led to the TV series Here Come the Brides, if you remember back that far, in which, racism was given a jolly face. But in any case, when he died, it was not news. And that was the case for about 20 years, until 1887, a day or two before Halloween, when a very small Seattle paper, the Seattle Sunday Star, came out with an article written by an old pioneer, Henry Allen Smith. It was a series, it was the 10th of a series that he had written about pioneers. There was a reason Henry Smith wrote this, and I'll allude to that later. And it was to justify the contribution of the pioneers who were being attacked at the time, but also to extol the virtues and their greatness about what they achieved here. The last essay of the series was to be the speech that he remembered having heard Chief Seattle give when Isaac Stevens, the first territorial governor, came here in January of 1854. 33 years after the speech was given, Smith sat down and he said he took notes. He wrote down bits and pieces of the speech, and then he put it together and he published it. And it created a sensation. As a matter of fact, it still creates a sensation. A single copy of it survives. This is amazing. One single copy of the newspaper. It wasn't a very widespread newspaper. It maybe had 200 or 300 people who were reading it. It was mostly a Sunday journal for Sabbath reading. And this speech shows up, and in the single copy that survives, which is in microfilm at the University of Washington, someone, probably while it was still in paper form, wrote one of the greatest orations ever given by a Native American up in the upper right-hand corner. And that's largely the reputation the speech has had since then. And people have debated since then, was that really what Seattle said? Did he say something like this? And the debate goes on. And the debate was contentious enough to essentially obscure the man. The best time a history of Seattle could have been written would have been around in the 1880s and 1900s. None ever were. If anybody cared, most of the care went, well, did he really say that? And so it was simply, the work was simply not done. But once the speech got out, it spread. And it began to be well known amongst other people in the United States. And when people began to come into Seattle after the railroad made Seattle far more accessible, being out in the middle of nowhere, people began to ask, well, why does it have this strange name? Why did you name it after an Indian? And so people were sort of nervous. Well, I don't know, it seemed like a good idea at the time. And anyway, we don't know how to pronounce it actually, but there it is, you figured it out. And the questions were, well, who was this guy? So they began to try to track down some information. And in 1890, a grave monument was erected over Seattle's grave at Suquamish. Up until that time, it was just an earth mound with a wooden cross on it. And on the marble monument that they erected there, both pioneers and the Suquamish and the Duwamish people did that. They wrote, Seattle, aged approximately 80 years, was a chief of the Suquamish, Duwamish, and allied tribes, a friend of the whites, and because of that, the founders of Seattle named the town after him. That was it, and that pretty much answered all the questions people assumed others would ask. It's enough to give us a beginning. The birth of 1780 is a very important clue about what kind of world Seattle grew up in. And the only word that we can take from the English vocabulary is apocalyptic. It was an absolutely apocalyptic world. In the 1780s, late 1770s, 1780s, that was the beginning of the maritime fur trade, when European fur traders were coming to the Northwest coast because it was discovered a single sea otter pelt would give you 50 Spanish dollars in China. This was more than a year's wage of an officer on a Royal Naval vessel. So most of the crews mutinied, and their officers too, and they took off to the Northwest coast to get as many of these as they could and trade them into China and become rich. And basically the early trade in the United States was based upon the fur trade between China and the Northwest coast and the United States. But what they brought with them, besides a desire to get sea otter skins, was disease. And those diseases the native people had no immunities for. And so right off the bat, about 50% of the population disappeared. It was depopulation to at least 50%. To have anything comparable like this, in the Western historical experience, we have to go to the Black Death, where generally 20 to 30% of the population died. In some areas it was 100%, some areas here it was 100%. But it was generally 50%, and as a result, the native societies crashed. They simply could not sustain the life ways they had evolved over centuries when the population was halved. And the diseases emanated from Vancouver Island, from the Columbia River, where the first trading emporiums were developed. Soon it began to come over the mountains from the east because the trade went up the Columbia and the diseases infected the interior areas. Those first peoples that were affected by it responded by doing what they could to rebuild their populations. And in this case, particularly for the northerners on Vancouver Island, who were maritime people, and for the Chinookan peoples at the mouth of the Columbia, who were also maritime and had large vessels, they took to slave raiding. And so what they would do would go and attack a village, kill off the men, seize the women and children, and bring them back to rebuild their populations so that they could sustain the traditions that they had, much of which involved feasting and gift-giving and the circulation of wealth. A rich man would gather wealth so that he could give it away in a potlatch, and that would mark his status as a noble, as a generous nobleman. A woman could do the same thing. But in order to do that, you had to have a lot of people gathering a lot of stuff to be able to acquire wealth in order to give it away. So that was the immediate outcome. And so what we have are people attacking other people. It happened that because the trade began on the northwest, on the west coast of Vancouver Island and at the mouth of the Columbia, traders were also trading metal and weapons to Native people. Americans especially. The British did not want to trade weapons, let's say muskets and rifles at all. But the Americans were happy because they did get a lot of money for that, a lot of furs for that. And so the people became armed rather quickly, which meant that the raids were far more lethal than they otherwise would have been. This was the world in which Seattle was born and in which he grew up, and was a chaotic place. And that chaos left a deep mark on his character. He was born from a father that came from the White River, and a mother who, ancestors, well, not ancestors, I mean, the previous generation, when the die-off occurred in the White River Valley, a number of noble families from around Renton, where Renton is today, on the Black River, moved south, literally picked up their house posts and moved south and set up a village at where a log jam had occurred on the river. It was a mile-long log jam, and they built their village at a downstream inn, a transportation break if there ever was one. And it was called Stoke, the log jam. The name for the log jam was Stoke, and the people there were the Stokosh, the people of the log jam. And they were nobles, and they lorded it over their neighbors, and they had a reputation for aggression, a significant reputation for aggression. A mile upstream was the village of Flea's House. This had a myth associated with it. This was a noble village too, but apparently it had been so decimated by the diseases that most of the nobles died off, and the children that survived were orphans. Well, orphans made very poor marriage partners, and so they were, the best they could look forward to was being brought in as second or third wives, as concubines into marriages. And so the village lost status to the point where it was said the people at Stoke treated the people of Flea's House like slaves. And so the idea of you have a noble village and a slave village, a village of useless people, that was, they didn't call them slaves, but they called them useless people. There was actually a name for that. But in any case, Seattle was born of a family with that history. One of his grandmothers, probably on his paternal side, had actually been captured as a slave and carried to the north, ransomed and brought back, but the taint of slavery stayed with her. So Seattle had slave ancestry in his background, besides coming from a village tainted by poverty and the shame of not being noble. So he grew up with that. But still, he managed to, if there was nothing else, there was flux in Native society. And so a person with ambition, even if they had a poor ancestry, could make it in the world. There were so few people, there were so many opportunities available for them, and people were desperately looking for leadership, that if somebody like Seattle, who grew up and was a very intelligent and wise person, became very wise, could make a reputation for himself. But he always had to deal with that burden of his slave ancestry. It even survived his death. In the 1950s, a state legislature, whose name was George Adams, he was from Skokomish. He was a Twana nobleman, and he had no respect for Seattle at all. And when people were interviewing him, there was a short booklet written about him, and they asked him about Seattle. He goes, Seattle, he's a son of a slave. He grew up in Flea Town. So there's this memory of this Flea's House. This is the 1950. I mean, this is amazing. It's almost 100 years after, and they're still talking about this. So, and even in Seattle's lifetime, in the 1840s, American officials said, were it not for his good sense, this story about his slave ancestry, and it was said that his mother was a slave, his story of his slave ancestry would cause him real trouble. Well, Seattle always had that trouble with him, and he had to find a way to surmount it. One of the ways he did was by seeking a supernatural power. Nobles constantly did this. Common people did too. You had commoners and you had nobles. About a third of the population were considered nobles, and the rest were commoners. Slaves was a thin stratum at the bottom. But anybody could seek a supernatural helper. They were believed to be populating the world, and like the people, they traveled around the periphery of the world. From March to November, the Native people left their winter villages and went out to collect food to sustain them during the winter. And their guardian spirits went out too. We have an idea in the West of guardian angels. that's probably the closest analog we can get to understanding what this was. And when they call them Sklalitut, when the Sklalitut wanted to rejoin their human host, they did in November when the people came back to their winter villages. And then they held a religious celebration. It was the winter dances, in which the guardian powers would inhabit, and some who had ceremonial powers would display the power that they had. It might be to handle fire without being burned, to heal wounds, to find lost objects, whatever, prophesy the future. And these winter dances were some of the most important events of the year for the native people. And it was like a combination of Thanksgiving, Easter, Christmas, and the 4th of July, all in one. And it was a very serious affair. But it was also where families got together and visited, and they were for days and days of celebration. In any case, when Seattle participated, he found a power which was known as Hwep. Hwep was thunder. So Seattle had thunder power. And years later, well, almost a century after Seattle's death, one of the family who knew, at least knew, if not were related to Seattle in a sort of a cousinage, in any case remembered Seattle's power. Her name was Amelia Sneedlum, and she said, oh, Seattle's power was a very great power. And it was thunder. And when Seattle spoke, when he was angry, and with Seattle, when thunder power, when he danced his power at the winter dances, he had 2 rattles. They were shaped like ducks. They were hollow wooden rattles filled with some gravel. And he would shake these rattles as he danced from one end of the longhouse to the other, singing his song in his booming, powerful voice. And his Amelia Sneedlum recalled, yes, it was a great power. When Seattle was angry, it was the person he was angry at who shook, which was an interesting play on the image of him shaking his rattles. But when he was angry, the person he was angry at was the one who shook. Because of the chaos of the time, slave raiders coming into Puget Sound from the north, from the south, from the east, and from the west, from the Slalom coast. When Seattle was still small, 7 or 8 years old, a raid came down and attacked the people at what is now Ballard in Seattle, at Salmon Bay. Killed the men, grabbed the women and children. They were hauled off screaming. It wiped out the Shunchol people. And as a result, kin moved in to retake their place. But it was a terrible event, and it just stunned the native people. In the middle of Puget Sound, these raiders could come down with impunity and attack. And one of Seattle's uncles, a man named Ptah, which we say Kitsap, had an idea that individually the groups were no match for the raiders who were coming down from the north. These were largely Cowichan people from the east coast of Vancouver Island. Individually, they couldn't match them, but if they organized together, if they formed a confederation and an alliance, perhaps then they could, one, defend more successfully, but also take the attacks to the home ground of the raiders and teach them a lesson. So that's what he planned to do. And Kitsap was an extraordinary man. One of the ways he did this, to create this alliance, was to focus on a building. And he would invite people to potlatches, and then he would essentially harangue them. You know, this is what we need to do. This could work. We need to think about this. And people would agree. He said, if you agree, let's keep talking and planning. In the meantime, build an apartment on this house. Build where you can stay. We all stay together. We all talk together. We'll figure this thing out. And people began, groups from far and wide, began to come and build onto this house, which ended up being close to 600 feet long. It was known, after the days of its glory had passed, it was known as the old building of Rulalan, which in the Chinook jargon was just this Oleman, which means something old. And we get Old Man House from it. At the time, it was probably the largest wooden structure on Puget Sound. It was enormous. Now, this is before there was, machine-cut lumber. Every plank had to be carved by hand, split and finished by hand. To some of the rafters, Navy officers who visited in the 1840s could not imagine how the people could have lifted these rafters onto uprights without the uses of blocks and tackles and lots of rope. And Kitsap even arranged a contest where, okay, we have these, they're 60 feet long, they're 2 feet in diameter at one end, and they're a foot in diameter at the other. We have to get them up. Come and we'll have a contest and see who can come up with the best idea to do that. And so all these things came together, and eventually he built his house, he built his alliance. But it took decades for him to do this. In the meantime, the raids come in and leave as they may, and there was a word of one, this is about 1810, 1806, 1810. There was word of a raid coming down from the mountains. Now in the 1740s, the horse first showed up in eastern Washington, and gradually, people on horseback began to appear west of the mountains. And the local people thought, well, they had never seen anything like that. People, what is this, a new species of elk? Because, and then they figured out, wait, these are people on them, they're on antlerless elk. That was the closest that they could come. They'd never seen anything, it was like an apparition. And of course, all new things in this chaotic time had a tremendous supernatural dimension to them, as you can well imagine. It would be like, you walk outside one day in the skies and unzip, and there's all the angels blowing the trumpets for the apocalypse. It would be something similar to that. In any case, these raiders came, these people came over the mountains, they traded and they raided. The native people called them Tobshadat, which was something like calling them Vikings. To go a Viking meant you just went off to trade and take a few heads, and the Tobshadat did the same thing. They intermarried with the people near the passes, on the western side of the passes, and they became a very significant influence in the Puget Sound country, and they were extremely attractive marriage partners because they were wealthy, they were mobile, and so they married the noble families. Kitsap probably had ancestry with these people. In any case, they were coming down the White River and the Duwamish to attack the villages in Elliott Bay. Word got out, and so the elders of the villages in Elliott Bay went over to Old Man House, Kitsap's thing, and said, okay, what are we going to do? We need to come up with some strategies. They're not coming from the north. They're coming over the mountains. They're going to come down in canoes. How can we distinguish, the normal canoes from their canoes? Because they've intermarried with the people at the head of the rivers. So it was open to suggestion, and Seattle stepped forward with a possible plan. Now remember, this is a man who has slave background. His grandmother or his mother is a slave. Who is going to listen to the son of a slave? So it was a risky thing for Seattle to do. And what he said was, look, what we'll do is I have followers, we'll get together, we'll form a group. I know where there's this tree on a sharp bend in the lower White River. We'll cut that, drop it on the river, and use it as a barrage, a barrier. If we're lucky, the raiders won't notice until they collide with it, and then we'll attack them. And sounds good, knock yourself out. So he was basically given permission to do this, and he did. So they went to the bank of the lower White River, cut the tree down. It took them all day to get the tree down. They had it so it was just a few inches above the water, and it was at a sharp bend. Sure enough, early the next morning, the raiders came down, and before they could even see what was there, 3 of the 5 canoes collided with the log and upended, and then Seattle's young warriors got out, he and they shot arrows and wiped out the party. Those who managed to swim the shore met other warriors there who gave them the same surprise. So it became the hallmark of Seattle. Seattle became a war leader, and he was it had all the hallmarks of his handiwork, which was that it was quick, brutal, bloody, and successful. It worked. And this was the reputation that he nurtured. And he became a feared raider throughout the central Puget Sound region, raiding as far as Snoqualmie Falls, the north coast of the Olympic Peninsula, further up the White River, Ventuana on the Hood Canal. So he was very successful and a very frightening person. Because of that, he became famous, he gained status, gained wealth, and he married. And his first wife gave birth to a daughter, died shortly thereafter. By the way, the death of his first wife may have led to Seattle in a rage, going after the shaman he believed had cursed her and caused her death. And so he attacked him, who was a Skykomish man, caused a huge row in central Puget Sound. I will allude to that a little bit later because it involved the Hudson's Bay Company. But in any case, Seattle married. The wife died, but the daughter survived, and her name was Sabanitsa. which the settlers later changed to Angeline. And that was the birth of Princess Angeline about 1810. So Seattle becomes a war leader. In the meantime, trade continues with Western nations. Trading posts are set up in Vancouver Island at the mouth of the Columbia in 1811 with Fort Astoria. Later, the Hudson's Bay Company comes in 1820-21, builds Fort Vancouver on the Columbia River, just across from the mouth of the Willamette, and then expands. And in 1824, they decide to move north onto Puget Sound and build a post somewhere north. And the head of the Hudson's Bay Company, who was George Simpson, came down the Columbia River. And by this time, of course, the Northwest Company had built, the Pacific Fur Company had built Fort Astoria and was later sold in the War of 1812 to the Northwest Company. And they ran it until 1821. And they built forts, Walla Walla, Okanagan, and were spread throughout much of the region. And they incurred a lot of native displeasure, and so the Cowlitz Indians especially had no truck with them, and they closed the easiest and quickest passage to Puget Sound. So George Simpson, who was the head of the Hudson's Bay Company in the northwest corner of North America, decided he was going to outflank them, send an expedition north around through Willapa Bay, Grays Harbor, up the Chehalis River to Puget Sound, then up to the Fraser River, where they would build Fort Langley, which they did in 1828. So in 1832, they decided, well, we need another post between Fort Langley and Fort Vancouver, and the southern end of the Sound is the beginning of a portage. The Cowlitz Indians decided, if you can't beat them, join them, and so they, the portage was open once again. In any case, the Hudson's Bay Company expanded throughout the region, all the way up to Russian Alaska, from Hawaii and Spanish California near San Francisco. The Hudson's Bay Company had trading posts all throughout the Northwest and the West. And Seattle was a war leader. When he first shows up in 1833 in company records, one of the surgeon that the company had hired, he was a young Scot from Edinburgh, and he had just graduated from the medical university there. His name was William Fraser Tolmie. And Tolmie, who was in his very early 20s, kept a journal. And that journal and the daily log of the work at the Journal of Occurrences of Nisqually House is our record of what's going on in the Puget Sound region. And Tolmie said that when he first saw Seattle, he says, he's the handsomest Indian I've ever seen, the face of a Roman senator. That's in May of 1833. Seattle strides into history. He's already in his late 40s, going into his 50s. Soon he gets a reputation as someone that's really scary. He threatens people with guns, he gets involved in fights. At one point when he kills the Skycoma shaman, the company, a fellow Suquamish headman, Chalicum, who wants to get in good with the company, manages to broker a peace between them. And it works, but Seattle, at one point, Seattle so causes problems for the company that the company clerk who's filling out the Journal of Occurrences, in his own language, says, I wish they would just murder the brute. He's talking about the Suquamish people. So Seattle had a reputation. He never went anywhere without an armed guard. At least 12 or 14 people armed to the teeth. So this was a person, he had more negative epithets associated with his name than any other native leader in the Journal of Occurrences at Nisqually House. So he was not going to be a company man. Chalicum was a company man. He trained with the company. He was a religious missionary for them. His son became a trader. So he was comfortable with the company. Seattle was not. In the meantime, Seattle's raids become more violent and widespread. In about 1845, he carries out an attack on the Chemicum people. Whenever there was an epidemic of measles or diphtheria or whatever, typhoid, malaria, it was always followed by a wave of fear, which is understandable because these epidemics just showed up. Whites didn't seem to be quite as affected by them as Native people, and so the people were, what kind of powers do you have? Obviously our supernatural powers aren't powerful enough. What powers do you have? So they were very interested to hear the religious message that white people brought. Seattle was not. Seattle's idea was power. Comes out of the end of an arrow or a musket in whatever case. But in any case, in 1845, there had been an outbreak of measles and there was the fear of sorcery. There was real animosity between the Chemicum, who were a people who spoke a different language. They lived where Port Townsend is today, and the S'Klallam on the Libby Peninsula, and the Suquamish, with whom they had been fighting for at least a generation or two. And Seattle made a deal with the S'Klallam and says, let's just get rid of these people, solve the problem, just get rid of them. And so Seattle, the Suquamish, and his Duwamish warriors from the White River Valley days got together, and they left in many canoes, and they surrounded the Chemicum village and wiped it out to a person. There were very few survivors, and they fled north to a S'Klallam community in Port Townsend and to the head of Hood Canal. So that was Seattle's reputation. But that was not the sum total of let's say native politics. When the Cowicans were raiding in the 1820s and 30s, around 1825, and Kitsap had created this alliance, it was ready to be put into use around 1825. He gathered 200 canoes of warriors, and they left Suquamish and traveled north, got to Vancouver Island, attacked the village they thought was the Cowichan village. It turned out it wasn't. It was probably the one in Victoria Harbor. But they took people prisoner. They spent an afternoon harvesting camas out of a nearby meadow. And the chief of the captured people said, you know, the Cowichans, the one you want to attack, are going to be coming here this way because they're going to be attacking the S'Klallam today. And so you might want to just release us and let us go and, you know, take your argument with them further north with you. They wouldn't hear of it. And as they were leaving with the slaves in their canoes and the tamas and all that, around the point comes the Cowichan canoes, just on a visit with this Sioux village at the Victoria Harbor. Both people are stunned. There's all these hundreds of 200 canoes from Kitsap's alliance who want to attack the Cowichans. And here are the Cowichans. So they attack. And it's a tactical disaster for the Puget Sound people. The Cowichans have larger canoes, they ram, or they back, just like the Greeks did in Salamis, they back. The Puget Sound allies come forward, they're overconfident, and then the Cowichans ram them on the sides with their large canoes. It is a disaster. It is said that of the 200 canoes who went out, barely 40 got back. But the thing was, it was a tactical disaster, but it was a strategic victory. The Cowichans could not believe that the Puget Sound people were capable of anything like this. Here they attacked them in their own waters? This was astonishing. And Kitsap followed it up. Kitsap was one of the survivors. And what he did was apparently what native Puget Sound people had done since time immemorial. When you have a powerful incoming group, and there were all sorts of groups migrating around here and there, when they show up, and at first they are seizing land and slaves perhaps, and you have to fight them, and you can continue to fight them, but it's kind of a waste of time. What you can do is intermarry with them. And then the etiquette of kinship and family suppresses the tendency to violence. So that's what Kitsap said, well, you know, this is what we can do. You see, you know, we are not the defenseless people you think we are. How about we let bygones be bygones and intermarry? And that happened. And so the Suquamish and a lot of the other Puget Sound tribes began to intermarry with the Cowichans. Seattle married off Sabalitza Angeline to a half Cowichan, half Skagit man on Whidbey Island. He used to go fish on the Fraser River every fall. You could never do that unless you were close with the Cowichans. So this worked. This was a lesson that Seattle learned, that when a powerful group comes in, you can fight, but if you need to, you can also intermarry, and that works as well. So, you know, you just let relatives duke it out with each other over Thanksgiving dinner. But in any case, by 1845, when Seattle had wiped out the Chemicum, who were a people surrounded on all sides by enemies, it was the same year Americans began to come north over the Columbia and settle in the Puget Sound region. Now the Americans had been coming to the Pacific Northwest since the 1820s. And in around 1837, 38, they'd actually fought a war with the Cayuse Indians after the killings at the Whitman mission site in Waiilat in eastern Washington. The Oregon Territorial Volunteers had fought the Cayuse and the Palouse. And a lot of Native people began to wonder, well, wait a minute, these people are unlike any we've ever encountered before. They have the weapons, they also have the ammunition and the powder and the shot, and we don't have any of that stuff. They can make these things. What are we going to do? Some council kill them now while there are not too many of them. That was a chief of the Snoqualmie who came up with that idea. His name was Pat Keenan. In 1847, he held a huge assembly at Whidbey Island, probably taking a cue from Kitsap, who by then was no longer a part of the scene. In any case, he held this assembly, and in it he argued for, look, they're few in number now. We could drive them out, and not only that, we could drive out the Americans who are coming in, but also the British. And then if we took Fort Nisqually, think of all the stuff, trading goods we had. We'd be the richest people around. And so that was what he proposed. But a lot of other native, some other native headmen weren't so sanguine about that. One was a man named Grayhead Chisuacut, who came from where Olympia is now. The first Americans to settle on the Puget Sound settled near his villages, where Tumwater is today. And the Americans were few, the Native people were many, the Americans were not stupid, so they formed an alliance with the people of Olympia, with old Grayhead's people. And they agreed, okay, we won't do this and this and this if you don't, murder slaves when your chiefs die, but we can't bear that. And they intermarried. And so old Grayhead got up in front of the assembly and said, well, Pat Cannon, a lot of the people that are raiding us are your people, not just the Cowegians. Your Snoqualmie are coming down and raiding, which is true. And we've made an alliance with the Americans. We're working quite well with them. And so that went back and forth for a while. And then the Duwamish chief stood up. The Duwamish chief stood up and gave a brief speech, said, look, my people will defend all the people at the head of the sound near Olympia from any raiders. You don't have to worry about that. He didn't say not to attack the Americans, interesting enough. He just said, don't worry about raiders, I can defend you from that. At which Grayhead said he would take one American with a rifle that all the Duwamish warriors put together. Well, that basically brought the whole thing down, and the assembly broke up, and there was a lot of acrimony. Who was this Duwamish chief? Well, it had to have been Seattle. It was his mother's people were the Duwamish, and he was a powerful war leader. There was no other Duwamish chief that was anywhere nearly as significant as he was. So I'm assuming that was the person who made that proposal at Whidbey Island. So the Americans, on the other hand, there were actually two Americans who witnessed this whole thing. They were hiding. One of them had actually married Pat Kenham's daughter. It's an amazing series of connections here. But anyway, they came back to Olympia and said, we saw they're going to kill us. They're going to wipe us all out. You better be ready for this. Sure enough, next year, 100 armed warriors, Pat Canham, Snoqualmie, and Skykomish, come down to Fort Nisqually near where Steilacoom is today. And they said they wanted to talk. And the reason they gave for being there armed was, well, one of Pat Canham's daughters has married in Nisqually and he's mistreating his wife. And we need to have a word with him. Can you send him out? So the last thing he was going to do. But so Pat Canham went into parley into Fort Nisqually, and his men sat down. And then inside the fort, having nothing to do with any of this, a man named Goho was cleaning a gun, and it went on. And so the Snoqualmie guys hear a gunshot from inside the fort. So they get up and they charge the fort, thinking, our leader is under threat. The Hudson's Bay Company barely closes the door in time. 2 Americans are left outside. They're shot down. A shootout occurs. Several other Native people are shot and killed, a child as well. And that's where it stands. And then Pat Canham comes back out. He's not unharmed. He said, okay, we need to settle down. And they leave. But as he left, the Americans remember him saying, I'll be back for you. And so the word was out, we have a race war. And of course, the Americans were quite ready to believe the worst about Native people, and especially that they all wanted to wipe them out. The Americans, there were already troops, this was 1849. By this time, the United States and Great Britain had agreed to partition Oregon on the 49th parallel. So that became what would be Canada, north of the 49th, and the southern part became the Oregon Territory, which the United States recognized. And it appointed a territorial governor, Joseph Lane, sent troops to protect wagon trains already coming in to the area with settlers, with hundreds of settlers, just as Pat Canham had said they would. And there was still fighting going on east of the mountains between whites and Native people. So what was going on? What was going to happen? Nobody knew. But Seattle made a decision. Now, the Americans two had been killed, and so the American authorities decided to hold a show trial at Camp Stillicum Barracks, where the town of Stillicum is today, to show American justice, how we dealt with people who threatened us. And so, with the $2,500 Congress had put aside to buy gifts for the Indians, they paid for a jury to come to march north to Stillicum and hold an American court, in which they did. And they arraigned several of Pat Canham's kin. They arrested them and brought them down, arraigned them at trial, and had a grand jury, indicted 2, tried them, indicted 4, tried and convicted 2, hung them the next afternoon at 4. Everybody, all the Native people were commanded to be there to witness the trial. It was said, if the missionaries, which had been active in the area, if they can't teach you to fear God, the Americans will teach you to fear them. And so they hung these 2 men. And to make sure the message got through, the Americans invited Pat Canham and another chief, a Slalom chief named Chetzemoka, to go to, they gave them a paid trip to San Francisco. They shipped them out and said, we want you to see an American city. We want you to see just how powerful and numerous we are. So they went down to San Francisco, which was a city of 20,000 people at the time, in the bloom of the boom of the gold rush. And they had never seen anything like it. That was probably more people gathered together in one spot than any of them had ever seen in their lives. And so the 2 chiefs went back. Pat Canham said, it's obvious we cannot fight this people. We have to find another way. Chetzemoka came to the same conclusion. Seattle had already figured it out without having to be sent. And of course, no one would have sent him because the Hudson's Bay Company did not like Seattle at all. They communicated that to the Americans. But anyway, Seattle decided he would go Kitsap's route. So what he did in 1850, late 1849, early 1850, he moved many of the Duwamish people down to what had just become Olympia, the little frontier town of Olympia. It had a saloon that said it was a stump and 3 glasses. But in any case, so he moved several hundred people down, and they built huts along the west shore of what became Olympia, and that became known as Chinook Street. There were 20 houses built there, probably 200 people. Seattle moves his whole tribe down there. And then as Americans come in, and he examines them, he checks them out, he invites some to, why don't you go up north? You want to settle? I know a place for you. Come up with my people, and we will show you a great place to settle. And so Seattle begins this operation. Early on, one of the first people he meets is a man named Robert Fay, who is a commercial merchant from San Francisco who has the idea to replicate what the Hudson's Bay Company had already been doing in Puget Sound, was to barrel salmon, trade them to Hawaii, and trade them to San Francisco. Yeah, but wait, before it became San Francisco. It was a money-making proposition, so Fay thought, I can do this too. So he brought a Swedish cooper, George Martin, up with him. They sailed north, and they got to the Columbia, and they traveled north and got to Olympia, and they met Seattle. And Seattle said, well, I know exactly where you need to go to set up shop, and I can provide all the laborers you need. We've been fishing for salmon since, before the beginning. We know what to do. Come on up. We have all the wood that you'll need for barreling and whatever. So they do. So they go up with him, and they build the first industry, the first Western industry in Elliott Bay. Now, this is a year before the Denny Party shows up. And so Fay and Martin and Seattle form a fishery. And Martin makes the barrels, and Seattle has 700 native people fishing on Elliott Bay and around in the rivers, and they barrel up the salmon, and Faye sends them off to San Francisco. So this is a going concern. And while this is happening, other Americans are venturing north over the Columbia. One of them is David Denny. The Denny party has gotten to Portland. You can turn that off, please, thank you. They had gotten to Portland, and they all had malaria at the time. They didn't really want to settle. All the good land had been taken. They wanted to found a town somewhere. So David Denny is going to pasture the cattle, the horses, and on the north side of the Columbia, he goes up looking for pastures. He gets up to Olympia, and there he meets Robert Fay, who says, well, meet Seattle. He's got a message for you. And Seattle says, come on with us. We're going up to work on the fishery. This is, if you know, we can use all you Americans that we can get. And so David Denny goes up with them. 3 other Americans also went up. Their names were Benjamin Franklin Shaw, Isaac Eby, and a man named Daniel Kinsey. And they went to Olympia. Seattle had them come up. They turn left at Elliott Bay after they come up on the canoe. And they land on the east side of Elliott Bay at a large longhouse at a native village. And all the native people come pouring out of the longhouse, shooting guns, waving blankets, waving knives in the air. And the Americans are sure they're all going to be killed. But then Seattle steps out from the longhouse, and this is what he said. This is his first speech. My name is Seattle, and this great swarm of people that you see here are my people. They have come down here to celebrate the coming of the first run of good salmon. As the salmon are our chief food, we always rejoice to see them coming early and in abundance. This is in the summer. For that ensures us a plentiful quantity of food for the coming winter. This is the reason our hearts are glad today. So you do not want to take this wild demonstration as warlike. It is meant in the nature of a salute in imitation of the Hudson's Bay Company's salute to their chiefs when they arrive at Fort Victoria. I am glad to have you come to our country, for we Indians know but little, and you Boston and King George men, that's the Americans and the British, know how to do everything. We want your blankets, your guns, axes, clothing, and tobacco, and all of the things that you make. We need all these things that you make, as we do not know how to make them. And we welcome you to our country to make flour, sugar, and other things that we can trade for. We wonder why 3 Boston men should wander so far away from home and come among so many Indians. Why are you not afraid? This was published 50 years after the event by Benjamin Franklin Shaw. And the same debate that attended Henry Smith's speech, appearance of his speech, attends this one. Is this really what Seattle said? And the last part, why are you not afraid? The part that I didn't include in the book is Shaw's response, where he said, well, he stands in the bow of the canoe, well, we are Americans, we're afraid of nothing, we've come over 3,000 miles, blah, 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 blah. And so, obviously, he had 50 years to work on this speech, but there is part of the speech, there's part of the speech that's very interesting, and that is what Seattle says, this isn't warlike, this is an invitation of what the people do to celebrate the arrival of the Hudson's Bay Company chief when they come to Fort Victoria. And therein lies a very interesting story, because that's exactly what happened in 1842 with George Simpson on one of his many trips around the world. George Simpson could travel faster than anybody at his time. It was by canoe and by horseback and everything. As a matter of fact, the book and the movie Around the World in 80 Days was inspired by George Simpson's speed, his circumnavigation of the globe. In any case, Simpson showed up in 1842 at Fort Victoria, and Simpson had an interesting way. He could be a very dramatic person. He was a dour old Scot, but in any case, and a skinflint. But what he would do is he would he would have an entourage. They came in these great birch bark canoes, and they would stop about a mile away from the post that he was visiting. He always showed up when people least expected it, so he could really see what life was like at these posts, because he wanted to make sure they were economical. And so then he would stop, and he would dress in a suit, in his silk suit with a top hat. All the other people would dress, and then he would send his personal piper, his Scottish bagpiper, into the village to announce his arrival. So the man is dressed up in tartan, scarlet, the whole shebang, and playing his bagpipes. And so you can imagine the native people hearing this hideous sound coming through the forest. And this man shows up, and he said, he's killing a goose. And then Simpson shows up. So This happened. This is how, and Seattle was there when it happened. Now, we have the log at Fort Victoria writes about this visit and the aftermath. Oral history amongst the Suquamish people talk about Seattle visits. Seattle's a visit to Fort Victoria. He told his people, I'm going to go up there to get lots of blankets because I'm going to hold a potlatch, which he did later. And so, and you'll know when I come back when you hear the thunder. When you hear thunder, you'll know that I'm on my way back. Now, his power was Huayapua, thunder. It gave him a powerful voice. Apparently, there was also the association of weather control, that he could actually control the weather. If you want to find something like this in Western literature, you have to go back to Homer. And we apparently have many of these. It's sort of, in any case, there's one story that.
I'm sorry.
That's okay. That's all right. We'll wait.
Is that a hammer?
Yeah. Window
You
right
want
now.
to turn the phone on?
That would be helpful. Yes. In any case, on the raid at the Cowegians, there's one story about Seattle. It's a good time to bring it up. In which case, all the canoes are assembled on the beach, and Seattle is there. 5 canoes away, they're up on the beach, is another man, a Snohomish man. And he starts to criticize Seattle and bring up his slave ancestry. Your grandmother's a slave, your mother's a slave, your brother was combat. And so Seattle gets up, leaps over 5 canoes, grabs the man, lifts him over his head, and leaps back over the 5 canoes, and then throws him to the ground. And this is an incredible display of strength. Meanwhile, the Snohomish are trying to stab him with their knives, but he avoids all that. This is the kind of thing you'll read in the Iliad. These displays of strength. So Seattle is a very Homeric figure. So in any case, he says, you know, when you hear the thunder, you will know that I'm on my way back. Okay, let's go back to the Journal of Occurrences at Fort Victoria, in which Simpson's there, he comes for a day, and then a storm blows up, and it's thundering and lightning, and it's blowing so hard that no one, not even native people in canoes, can go out and travel. And so we've got the account in Fort Victoria. We have the folklore of Seattle saying, when it's thundering, I will come back. And then we have this element Seattle uses in his speech. So I think that's actually probably a nugget of authenticity in that speech. So I believe, yes, he did meet the 3 there. I mean, they're there because he set up the meeting to them, and then they went forward. He gave them guides. They went up to Lake Washington, Lake Duwamish, as it was called. They went up the White River Valley, and one of them, and it was actually Benjamin Franklin Shaw, who wrote an article about it in the Oregon Spectator, saying what a wonderful place it was. So Seattle's purpose was met. He wanted to get as many Americans there as he could. Well, let's go back to David Denny. Now he's coming up with Fay and Seattle up to Elkay, where they are there, where the fishery is located. And Denny is given the same tour. He's allowed to go, he's given guides, they take him into Lake Duwamish, Lake Washington, he goes up the White River, he comes back. He is completely blown away by this fertile country, so he writes a note to his older brother, Arthur. And it says, there's room here for 1,000 people, come at once. And so the Denny party shows up. And so that part of the history of Seattle, the town, begins. But only because of all this other stuff that Seattle has been responsible for. And Seattle is such a person, he is an impresario, as the Spanish used the term. A person who builds and nurtures a town. Later years, like in the later 1850s, when there was war between the native people and the Americans, Seattle made sure that he was aware of what was going on. He kept his ears open to both sides. And he warned people through intermediaries, you need to get into town. If you're out here in the periphery, no one can save you. You need to get into town and protect yourself. So that's what Seattle did. But long before the battles, in the 1852 and 53, when the settlers, they moved from Elkay Point to the western shore of Elliott Bay. Now, Fay all his salmon, not all, a lot of his salmon rotted on the way down to San Francisco, so George Martin wasn't the best cooper he could have found. In any case, he decided, and then Fay decides, well, I don't know, I'm just going to settle on Whidbey Island. So tells Seattle that he's out of the business. Seattle goes back to Olympia to get a replacement to continue the fishery. Who does he get? David Maynard. He gets David Maynard to come back and resume the fishery that he and Fay have started to keep this industry going. And Maynard had just showed up in California with a cargo of damaged secondhand goods. He shows up at Olympia, and the Olympian merchants do not want him around, so they suggest to him that he might like to move elsewhere if he cares anything about his life. And at the same time, Maynard has fallen in love with a widow he met on the Oregon Trail. Her name was Catherine Troutman. She happened to be the sister of Michael Simmons, who was one of the most important pioneers and founders of Tumwater, Newmarket, and Olympia. And so Simmons did what wanted, and he knew Maynard was already married. He had a wife in Ohio. He had fled a bad marriage. He was going to seek a divorce from the Oregon Territorial Legislature. But so Simmons lets Maynard know that, you know, I don't want you messing around with my sister out here, and you might want to go elsewhere. And Seattle says, see, I can solve your problems, and I will give you my granddaughter, Betsy. Now, how do we know this? It doesn't show up in any of Bagley's history or Arthur Denny's. Well, but Thomas Prosh, who was a journalist, heard the story, and he includes it in his history, because it's history. Seattle offered his granddaughter, Betsy, to Maynard, and Maynard accepted. And so they all came north. Took them 4 days, because Seattle's resuming contacts with the fishery, and he brings Maynard into Elliott Bay, to the eastern shore, where, well, actually he bypasses where the site of the fishery was on the west shore, and he moves to the eastern shore by a village, his village, one of the villages that he is influential at, where his brother, Curly, is one of the sub-chiefs. And so they land there, but then Seattle finds that all the land's been claimed. Denny, Boren, Bell, they all moved over, and they took claims. It was actually the Indian women who got them over to help them build cabins there. The people who lived in that village of Tsitsi-Valley on the eastern shore, they wanted the Americans there, just like Seattle wanted them on the White River. So in any case, this is a real dilemma, and so the settlers realize what's going on. They don't want Seattle to lose face, and so they move up their claims to give the land, they say, to Maynard, but it's actually to give it back to Seattle so he could give it to Maynard, which is what happens. Now the interesting thing is, when they ask Maynard, well, come and settle with us, well, and Maynard is there because Seattle's with him. He doesn't want to embarrass the old man, so he said, I didn't come here to claim land. He says this, I didn't come here to claim land, I just came to work in the fishery. And so that's when they move their claims forward, and so Seattle can give him the land. It's a very interesting affair, and you have to really read several sources to be able to figure out what's going on. But in any case, that's what happens. So Maynard settles. That's in the late 1852, early 1853. In the fall of 1853, Henry Yesler shows up. And the same thing happens. Seattle has his brother Curly offer Yesler his daughter Julia. And Yesler accepts. He has a wife in Ohio too. But while these situations exist, the reality is on Elliott Bay, and so people are working together. And because Seattle is so instrumental in this, when the settlers got together, the name they gave their town is Duwamish, because those are the people they were living with on the eastern side of Elliott Bay. And so there was a post office called Duwamish. And they said, well, we could do a better name than that. What should we call our town? And it finally came down to, well, let's name it after this chief. He's basically the reason why we're here. He's our benefactor. In 2 winters, he made sure that the Americans didn't starve because he had the Indians give them potatoes from their gardens in Renton and what's now Tukwila. So Seattle was absolutely essential to not just the foundation of this community, but their survival as well. In this community, there were about 200 Native people and 26 whites, half of which were children. And so, who did they name it after? They named it after Seattle. And he was outraged. This is like, you can't use my name without my permission. This is my name. You want to call your little crummy neighborhood. You don't even live there, because you've got these quote claims, you have your families scattered around Elliott Bay, but you want to name this Seattle? It's not even my name, but it's like, your name you have to be, what is this? And so he was not happy. So he levied a tax on the people. He said, you want my name, you have to pay for its use, which was commonly how it was done. If you wanted to use somebody else's name, you had to pay for the right to use it. It was like a copyright. And so they did. And Ezra Meeker is the one who says, so he levied a tax on the people, and the people paid. And so Seattle was okay with that. That was about the high watermark of the communication, or let's say the cooperation between Native people and Indians. After that, things began to fall apart. Seattle got his divorce, Maynard got his divorce in Oregon. He married Catherine Blaine. What was he going to do with Betsy? He gave her to another settler who treated her so badly, she hung herself in her house on Elliott Bay. That caused a huge scene, a huge crisis, which wasn't improved when the pastor in town, David Blaine, said, I can't bury them in the cemetery because, well, they're Indians, and worse, they're Catholics. And so that was not to be done. And so he wouldn't allow them a Christian burial. And so that didn't improve things. We don't know what Seattle went through in his mind during this. Then Isaac Stevens, the first territorial governor, shows up in January 1854. Seattle and about over 1,000 Native people greet him on Elliott Bay right beneath Maynard's store. And Stevens comes in, he's got a galloping agenda. He's the governor of the new territory, he's the superintendent of Indian Affairs, and he's the head of the Northern Railroad Survey. He holds a meeting in Seattle the first night he's there, after he's gone up on a tour to look at the recently discovered coal mine in what is now Renton. They've just discovered coal in Renton, which means that that river passage is going to be really significant. They'll have large traffic bringing coal to Seattle. They will sell it to ships. Steam is beginning to appear in the Pacific coast. So Stevens makes he says to the white settlers gathered in Yesler's cook shack that, the day is going to come when you're going to hear the neigh of the iron horse coming down the pass, and Seattle is going to be the entrepot trade of the West Coast, and you will become a geometropolis like Venice or like London and New York. And on that day, Greater Seattle was born. But also the idea we could be world class. The next day, Stevens has the Native people assemble, and he tells them what their future is going to be. We want to buy your land, and then we're going to give you, but you'll be able to keep land that you can live on. What we're not telling you, though, is this is really going to be in isolated areas because we don't want you near us. You're prospering, and everybody's prospering because you're together, but we're going to separate you. We're going to put you in places where hopefully you'll die. He doesn't say that to them, but that's what the theory was. They already made plans for the reservations. The initial plan was to take the S'Klallam of the Atlantic Peninsula, the Duwamish and the Suquamish, and put them on a reservation on the northeast coast of Hood Canal, where nobody had ever lived because no village could ever survive there. That's where that reservation was going to be. When word of that got out, when the treaty councils began to be held, Seattle and the Duwamish said, we are not going to participate in this. We are not going to be there. And Stevens faced a real problem. This was in December of 1854. And what were they going to do? So Stevens sent his Indian agent for Puget Sound, Michael Simmons, to talk with Seattle. So Stevens sent Simmons, Seattle sent William, who was the chief of the Duwamish at Renton, and they spoke, and Simmons said, well, what do you want? And he said, well, I want the west bank of the Duwamish River from Elliott Bay all the way down to 3 Creek Point. And he says, too much, but we will talk about this in the future. And it was left at that. But many Duwamish were not convinced. And so when the Treaty Council was held at Point Elliott in January of 1855, of the 22 sub-chiefs that the Americans selected to represent the Duwamish, only 3 went, Seattle and those 3 chiefs. And he signed, the treaty was signed in which they were to give away all their land. The Duwamish, by that time the reservations had been selected. When the Americans realized that Hood Canal thing wasn't going to work, they chose a place on the west side of Puget Sound, which is now the Port Madison Indian Reservation. But nothing for the Duwamish. And later when they went to war, the lower river Duwamish fought with the Americans. The upper river Duwamish did not. They fought against the Americans. Stevens decided to give them a reservation, but the Duwamish allies never received anything. And so they became a reservationless tribe, what they were called as a landless tribe. That would end up, we are still in that situation. The Duwamish are still in that situation today, as you know. In any case, Seattle had made his decision. He was going to support the Americans, and he did. He was nothing if not single-minded. During the war, he sided with the Americans, but he let the Americans know how stupid they were on several occasions. And in one, I'm going to read you an account that this is to Simmons. And this is just as the war is winding down. It was a near thing. I mean, Seattle was virtually wiped from the map. Every building in King County outside of just the center of Seattle was burnt down. 10% of the white population was killed. At least that percentage of Native people were killed. Seattle would not, the town of Seattle would not regain its population until 10 years later. It was a heavy blow, not just for the Americans, but for the Native people too. So in 1857, Simmons, the people are just beside themselves. They're starving, there's warfare. I mean, it's like, what do you people want from us? And so finally Simmons tries to make peace with the Grichison people, and he visits Chief Seattle. And this is Seattle's, really his last speech. I want you to understand what I say. I do not drink rum, neither does Noachites. They were accused of being drunkards. And we constantly advise our people not to do so. I am not a bad man. I am and always have been a friend of the whites. I listen to what Mr. Page, the Indian agent, says to me. And I do not steal, nor do I or any of my people kill the whites. Oh, Mr. Simmons, why don't our papers come back to us? That's the treaty papers. I fear, you always say they will come back, but they do not. I fear we are forgotten and are to be cheated out of our lands. I have been very poor and hungry all winter, and am very sick now. In a little while I will die. I would like to be paid for my land before I die. Many of my people died during the cold, severe winter without getting their pay. When I die, my people will be very poor. They will have no property, no chief, no one to talk for them. You must not forget them, Mr. Simmons, when I am gone. We are ashamed to think that the Puyallups have their papers. They fought against the whites, while we, who have never been angry with them, get nothing. When we get our pay, we want it in money. The Indians are not bad. It is the white men who are bad to us. If any person writes that we do not want our papers returned, they lie. Oh, Mr. Simmons, you see I am very sick. I want you to write quickly to our great chief what I say. I have done. So that was the last we hear from Chief Seattle. His vision was basically killed off, at least, let's say, he was basically killed off for a century. He died, essentially, the whites believed history had passed it by. But it did not. And so I'm here today. It took 160 years to get a biography written of Chief Seattle, which is an astonishing thing when you think that Seattle is the largest city named in the world, named after a Native American, and it took 160 years to get a biography written about it. In 1840, Eva Greenslit Anderson wrote a biography for children of Seattle, which is a very good biography, but it's very limited. But nevertheless, she made the attempt. If it had been made at any time before that, there had been so much more evidence available for us to have a much richer picture of the man. What I have done, what I have been able to do. One of the things that comes to me about Seattle was, one, what a creative, astonishing figure he was, how he could change when he needed to. He was a war leader. He became an impresario of a white city. I mean, this is amazing. That became a very prominent white city. He was an extraordinary speaker. He used metaphor, analogy, and simile. In the Treaty of Point Elliott, when the Americans were wrapping up the treaty, he is remembered to have said to his people, and people remember this, you observe these changers. Observe what they do, and raise your children to be like them, because they basically, you need to observe them well. His use of the word changers is very interesting, because in Native folklore, There was an age of the myth age, the age of titans, when monsters and powerful divine beings ruled the land. And then a person came through that transformed the world, basically crushed the titans and allowed human beings to be secure in the world. This was the changer. So here is Seattle saying, these people are like the changer. These Americans are like the changer. To understand who they are, you have to think in cosmic and metaphysical terms. That's what he's saying to his people. They are like that. They are remaking the world. If we want to survive, we have to understand what they're doing. That was an amazing thing for a man to say. And the way that he said it, how he said it, to be so memorable that people remember clips of what he said for over a century later, gives us some idea of just how skilled he was. But it took over a century and a half for that story to finally be made public. So there's lots of unfinished business with Seattle, with his people, the Duwamish, with the city named after him. And I won't bother to go into that. But I hope I have argued well that one, as I had two chapters that I began the book with, one was, is Seattle a worthy eponym for the city, a worthy namesake for the city? And I hope I have argued well that he is indeed a worthy namesake. It is we are honored to have his name as the name of our city. The second question was, is the city of Seattle worthy of the namesake? And the jury is still out. And when Mayor Durkin finally meets with the Duwamish after 160 years of their asking to meet with Native Authority, I hope that that will happen. And when it does, then some justice will have been done. In the meantime, thank you for having me here.
Here that we have a very distinguished member of our board of the Southwest Seattle Historical Society, Ken Workman, who is a fourth great-grandson of Chief Seattle.
Well, our speaker takes a breath and answers some questions perhaps. We're going to prepare to sell the some books, and they. What did you?
$28, and I can accept cash or checks. Yes, but I don't have a reader for a credit card. But you can get it at any bookstore.
And a lot of And I want to remind everybody that we have forms. Please stop by and fill out one of each of the forms. Humanities Washington and the library's form. And for those of you that have some energy, could you help with the chairs? Because the chairs need to be stacked, most of them in the carrier, wherever it is. And as we leave this evening, we have to be out of the building at 8. So now, some questions and answers perhaps?
If you have any questions, yes.
What is your thinking that it took 160 years for someone to write a book to have people as well?
The people, the pioneers who came in, who had no trouble intermarrying with Native people, I think had a genuine respect for them. It was the ones who came later, the middle class, educated Americans who came in, who were had imbibed of the racist sentiments that were so prevalent in the country. They really just dismissed the intent. It didn't want anything to do with it. The reason why they were put out in the time. I don't think they cared one way or the other about Seattle. I think they were embarrassed. A lot of people would argue that, well, the only reason Seattle's name is known is because the city is named after him, and so it's reflected glory upon him. And that was the attitude. And that was just because of the nature of American society, just the way it was, until the 1960s, and that began to change. And in the 70s, and of course we're in an unfortunate period now, but it's there's far more sensitivity to that. And you know, once Native people in the 1960s got legislation that essentially answered some of the promises that the federal government made, they took off, and now we have, you know, these really thriving Native communities around us, very influential Native communities. The Native voice in the preservation of the environment is simply unparalleled. And so we're listening. The Duwamish are still fighting the battle they were in the 1850s. And so that's an unfortunate thing. But it also focuses on life here in Seattle. Yes.
What I'm impressed about in your book is that after I got through a large part of it, you brought up the idea that you couldn't stop now. Because of the research, you got so far into it, you had to finish it. It took 164 years for you to do all the reading and everything. And so I'm just amazed.
Well, most of the information, the really new information, was in French. It was because of the letters written by the Oblate missionaries in the 1840s. Fortunately, my wife, Marianne, read French, and so she translated a lot of the letters for me. And I was just blown away by, I mean, the history of Puget Sound region in the 1850s has to be rewritten once this French material is digested, because it is simply too important to continue to ignore. It gives the native politics of the time, and that's a missing element in every history. Yes?
Still down on
Yes, it is.
Fifth Avenue.
Yes, Fifth, Fourth, I have to,
I haven't been that way, but I
Still is.
I remember coming from football games.
With his arm? Yes. Yes.
And it would always say what school would get their palms on.
That's right. And you know, go ahead, yes.
I was wondering about the translation and the English to the communication.
Yeah, well, the native language was a very complex one. But Americans, a lot of Americans assumed the Chinook jargon, which had about 200 words, and it was a trade patois. It was basically just engineered to promote, to facilitate trading. It was done in the simplest terms. Well, when the Americans were translating these legal documents, these treaties, this highly complex legal document, they translated the Chinook for the native people. Now, there were native people who understood Chinook, who translated it then into the Tutsi, which is the native language. But Leschi, for example, Leschi, at the first Treaty of Medicine Creek, was so shocked because he had been so friendly and so generous with the Americans, but he was going to lose all his pasture lands. He had all these horses and cattle, and that made no difference to the Americans. They put him on this awful plot of land overlooking Commencement Bay, and he couldn't believe that the treaty said that. But he couldn't read English, and so he went to Oregon to look up a cousin who he thought spoke English. It turned out the cousin didn't, but the Americans took his leaving as, see, he's plotting. He's doing like Pat Cannon. He's plotting against us. And so, the native people simply could not comprehend that this was being done to them. And they assumed that, from what we understand, from testimony that came later, was that in Elliott, for the Treaty of Point Elliott, they were going to get Snohomish County, about 2,500 miles. Well, they got a township. They got less than 30 square miles. And when the French Canadians told the officers at Fort Steilacoom, this is before the Indian War, the officers were asking, there was a leader in the East, Kamiakin, is he really going to raise war? They said, well, he could. He said, but we've signed these treaties. And they said, the people tell me they just gave you their names. They didn't give you the land. And the Americans were just astonished. They couldn't believe that, you mean they don't understand that we have their land? And so there was this lack of communication. This is all in French, of course, and so it needs to be made more widespread. But the inability, and let's say the unwillingness of the Americans to really try to understand a native viewpoint, that was just totally absent. And so, yeah, a lot of things, yes, Rob?
David, if you had the power to control the Seattle school district, and they asked you, what are the two things that all the children that go through the Seattle public schools need to know about Seattle?
This is the man?
Yeah, the man. What would the things be that you'd want them all to know, that they would have to know about him?
His image would have to be put up with other great social leaders. And I don't care, like Gandhi and Martin Luther King, because he had a vision of racial harmony and tolerance, not just tolerance, but a racial community, a biracial community. He saw the future. His vision needs to be communicated as far as I and others are able to understand it. But I believe what I have come up with is fairly accurate. And so he's not just a name that we use. He's as important today as he ever was in the past. I think he's more important. Seattle is more important today than he was then. because his vision, now has gravitas, if people are beginning to understand. You know, we're facing a multiracial future. Seattle understood that, and we need to buy into it. So that's one of the things. The other thing is that Native Americans aren't panoramas in a museum. That they need to know about the Duwamish tribe, that they still exist, and that they're still fighting for the rights granted to them in the Treaty of Equality. But those two things, Yes.
David, I've listened to you before, I've seen you on film, you're a very eloquent speaker, historian, and I really appreciate all of your work and your support for the Duwamish and the other native tribes. I can't help but notice though that when you're speaking of the Indians or the Native Americans, but that you call the white people Americans.
Yes.
And why is that?
They weren't British.
Well, but the natives are the original Americans.
No, the natives are the Duwamish, the Puyallup, the Muckleshoot. America comes from a word from a 1507 map made by a German map maker who mispronounced the name of Alberico Vespucci and turned it into America. And he gave those names to North and South America's colonies. We should be called Alberica, but he mistranslated, so we got Republic of America. That's not an Indian name.
No, I
Yeah,
understand.
no, there's nothing Indian about it. The guy was from Florence. He was an Italian. So the Americans called themselves Americans. That was their name.
That should be another thing that's taught in school.
Yes, absolutely, absolutely.
Thank you.
Go ahead. Yes, finish. He spoke Lashutsi. Any formal occasion, he always spoke the native language. He knew Chinook jargon, and he used it on occasion. They said he didn't understand it. He understood it very well. Did he understand English? Probably not. He probably had a working relationship with David Maynard and Faye. But he spoke in his native language because that's what leaders did. They spoke in the language of the people they represented, so their people would understand. Like, it was translated from Lashutsi to Chinook jargon for Isaac Stevens, but then it was translated from the jargon by Benjamin Franklin Shaw into English. So when Henry Smith is writing down notes, he's writing down snippets of the English translations of what Seattle said. And they said, well, he spoke the Indian language. No, he didn't. He spoke Chinook jargon. Henry Smith, you only did here a year. But it was translated, the speech was translated in English for the governor. As a matter of fact, in March of 1854, Simmons, who was an Indian agent, said at one other occasion, Seattle gave a great speech. He talks about Seattle, this is long after the speech was given, and Seattle was quite the speech. But he always spoke in his native language. Ken, I'm sorry, how big is the Duwamish tribe now?
600 or so, we've been that way for a decade.
Yeah, that's what I thought, about 600. Okay,
You sign books?
I absolutely, I will. Let me get my pen out, and I will sign the book, and I will dedicate it to whoever you want them to be. Okay, if you have books, let me sign them for you.